March 18, 1944. RAF Boxted, England. 0521 hours. Staff Sergeant Miles Theodore Voss watches another P-47 Thunderbolt spiral out of formation at 28,000 feet over the English Channel. There is no smoke trail. No explosion. No frantic distress call over the radio. Just a 7-ton fighter and its pilot dropping out of the sky like a stone. That is the 7th engine failure this week. In the last 40 days, 89 Thunderbolts have fallen, not to Luftwaffe 20mm cannons or flak, but to a silent killer inside their own cowling. 63 B-17 Flying Fortress crews have been slaughtered because their escorts simply vanished when the altitude hit 25,000 feet. The U.S. 8th Air Force is on the verge of total collapse. If the escorts can't fly, the bombers don't fly. And if the bombers don't fly, the invasion of Europe is dead in the water. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The experts at Republic Aviation have been hunting this ghost for 2 months. Their MIT-educated engineers have replaced superchargers and modified fuel lines, yet the engines keep quitting. They claim the failure is mechanically impossible under ground test conditions. But in the shadows of an unheated hangar, a 26-year-old mechanic from Duluth, Minnesota, has discovered the truth. Miles Theodore Voss never went to an Ivy League school. He learned about engines in -40 degrees Fahrenheit winters on Lake Superior fishing boats. He realizes what the scientists missed. The Venturi effect inside the carburetor is creating ice at extreme altitudes, choking the engine to death. His solution? A $2 heating coil and 20 minutes of labor. When the brass dismisses him and Republic Aviation threatens a court-martial for interfering with war production, Voss is left with a choice. He can watch more pilots die, or he can commit an act of treason. 3 hours from now, Voss is going to steal a fully armed P-47. He is going to fly an illegal solo mission into German-occupied airspace, deliberately stall his engine at 30,000 feet, and pray his $2 fix works before the Bf-109s or the ground catch up to him. By early 1944, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, affectionately known by its pilots as the Jug, had become the undisputed heavyweight champion of the European skies. Built around the massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine and armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns, it was a 7-ton masterpiece of industrial might. It could outdive anything the Luftwaffe threw at it, and its rugged airframe could soak up 20mm cannon fire like a sponge. For the B-17 Flying Fortress crews, the sight of a Thunderbolt's elliptical wings was the only thing that made a daylight run over Germany feel like anything other than a suicide mission. But on February 5, 1944, the legend of the indestructible Thunderbolt began to crumble in the thin, freezing air 29,000 feet over Belgium. Captain James Morrison was leading a flight of 4 when the world went silent. One moment, his R2800 was a rhythmic, screaming roar of power. The next, it was a dead weight. There was no coughing, no catastrophic internal explosion, and no spray of oil across the windscreen. As Morrison later described to a room of stunned intelligence officers, the engine simply quit, like someone had flipped a master switch. With his propeller windmilling uselessly, Morrison began a terrifying 60-mile glide toward Allied lines. He managed to belly land his aircraft in a French pasture, surviving by inches, but his report was just the first note in a funeral dirge that would soon haunt every airfield in England. By March, the anomaly had become a statistical massacre. A pattern emerged that defied the logic of the Republic Aviation engineers. The failures only occurred above 25,000 feet, and only during the long, frigid escort missions where pilots were pushed to the absolute ceiling of their aircraft. The Jug wasn't being shot down, it was surrendering. The consequence was a bloodbath for the big friends, the heavy bombers. Without their little friends to provide top cover, the B-17 formations were defenseless. The crisis peaked on March 6, 1944, a day the 8th Air Force would remember as Black Tuesday. As the massive bomber stream turned toward Berlin, a sudden, inexplicable wave of engine failures swept through the P-47 escort groups. Pilots watched in horror as their wingmen throttled back, their engines surging and then dying in the sub-zero stratospheric air. In less than an hour, an entire escort group was neutralized by its own machinery. The Luftwaffe pounced. German FW-190s and Bf-109s, seeing the gap in the screen, dove into the bomber boxes with predatory efficiency. 38 B-17s were torn from the sky, taking 380 airmen with them into the German soil. The weapon designed to win the air war had become a liability, and the commanders at RAF Boxted were out of answers. Republic Aviation's top minds were flying in from New York with briefcases full of blueprints, but they were looking at metal and fuel, ignoring the invisible ghost haunting the cockpit. They were certain the problem was a $1 million mechanical flaw in the supercharger. They had no idea that the answer didn't require a degree from MIT, but rather the intuition of a man who knew what it felt like when the cold starts to bite. While the generals debated grounding the entire fleet, Miles Theodore Voss was standing in a dark hangar, staring at a recovered engine with a flashlight in one hand and a terrifying suspicion in the other, a suspicion that would lead him to discover something so simple, it was almost insulting. By the second week of February, the airfield at RAF Boxted was swarming with men in tailored wool overcoats and polished shoes. These were the heavy hitters from Republic Aviation's headquarters in Farmingdale, New York, men with MIT degrees and slide rules who looked wildly out of place amidst the mud and oil of a frontline combat base. They arrived with crates of blueprints and an air of unshakable academic certainty. To them, the P-47 wasn't just an airplane, it was a multi-million-dollar corporate asset, and the mysterious engine failures were a direct threat to Republic's massive government contracts. The investigation team quickly locked onto a single culprit, the General Electric turbo supercharger. In the Thunderbolt, this massive turbine was housed in the rear fuselage, connected to the engine by yards of intricate ducting. It was the Jug's mechanical lung, compressing thin air to allow the R-2800 engine to breathe at high altitudes. The engineers theorized that under the sustained strain of escort missions, the supercharger's bearings were seizing or the lubrication system was cavitating. They spent millions in emergency funds to reinforce the bearing housings and modify the oil scavenging pumps. It was a sophisticated, expensive solution to a problem they were convinced they had diagnosed perfectly. On February 28, the first wave of fixed P-47s returned to active service. The mood on the flight line was cautiously optimistic. The pilots wanted to believe that the men who designed the plane had found the cure. But the optimism lasted exactly 4 days. On March 4th, 2 of the modified aircraft took off for a high-altitude sweep over the Ruhr Valley. At 27,000 feet, both engines surged, sputtered, and died. One pilot managed to bail out. The other was lost when his aircraft entered an unrecoverable spin. The failures were identical in every way to the unfixed models. Republic's engineers were paralyzed. Their ground tests in the United States, conducted in state-of-the-art temperature-controlled test cells, showed no mechanical flaws. The engines ran perfectly for hundreds of hours on the bench. Because they couldn't replicate the failure in a laboratory, they began to deflect. By March 12, the corporate rhetoric turned cold. Republic Aviation officially notified the War Department that any independent modifications or field-expedient tinkering by Army mechanics would immediately void all airframe warranties and liability protections. It was a billion-dollar game of chicken, prioritizing corporate legal defense over the lives of the men in the cockpits. Colonel Hastings, the base commander, was caught in the middle of a nightmare. He stood in his office overlooking the rain-soaked tarmac, watching ground crews tarp over fighters that were now effectively grounded. "We're losing the war in the air because of a paperwork standoff," he growled to his staff. "Republic says it's impossible, yet my boys are falling out of the sky like lead weights. If we don't find the ghost in these machines by the end of the month, the general is going to pull the plug on daylight bombing entirely." While the billion-dollar engineers packed their bags to head back to New York, claiming the military was simply overstressing the equipment, Staff Sergeant Miles Voss was standing in the shadows of Hangar 7. He wasn't looking at blueprints or bearing tolerances. Instead, he was staring at a recovered carburetor from a crashed ship, noticing a tiny, shimmering residue that wasn't oil, metal, or fuel. It was something so commonplace that most men walked over it every day, yet in the sub-zero vacuum of the stratosphere, it was more lethal than a German flak battery. Voss knew he had found the killer, but as he looked at the MPs guarding the flight line, he realized that proving it would require him to do something that would either make him a hero or get him executed before the week was out. Miles Theodore Voss was a man forged in a world where the cold wasn't just weather. It was a physical adversary. Born in Duluth, Minnesota in 1918, his childhood was defined by the iron-gray swells of Lake Superior. His family ran a commercial fishing fleet, and by the age of 12, Miles was the primary hand responsible for keeping the heavy diesel engines of their trawlers alive in sub-zero tempests. In northern Minnesota, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit was a standard Tuesday, a temperature where oil turns to molasses and steel becomes as brittle as glass. It was here, with frostbitten fingers and a rusted wrench, that Miles learned a fundamental truth. An engine on a blueprint is a fantasy, but an engine in the elements is a living thing. His father, a man of few words and calloused hands, had drilled a mantra into him that would eventually define his military career. Metal don't lie, Miles. But engineers do when they test in warm rooms. That philosophy carried him to the Dunwoody Technical Institute in Minneapolis, where he graduated in 1938. While his peers studied the lofty mathematics of flight, Miles obsessed over the gritty reality of combustion. He spent the next 4 years in a Minneapolis aviation repair shop, developing a reputation as an engine whisperer, the kid who could hear a fouled plug or a lean mixture from 3 hangars away. When the news of Pearl Harbor broke in December 1941, Miles didn't wait for a draft card. He enlisted the next day. The Army Air Forces recognized his talent but initially sent him to the humid, sweltering heat of the Pacific Theater. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, he kept P-40 Warhawks flying with spit and baling wire, but his mind remained elsewhere. He was a creature of the North, and the tropics felt like a fever dream. Then, in January 1944, the fever broke and turned into a nightmare. His younger brother, Thomas, was a tail gunner on AB-17 named the Minnesota Maiden. During a deep penetration raid over the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, the P-47 escorts mysteriously vanished from the formation at the critical moment. Without fighter cover, the Maiden was torn apart by German cannons. Thomas never made it to his parachute. The official report cited unexplained escort attrition, but Miles knew what it really meant. His brother had died because a machine failed. Carrying a crushing weight of survivor's guilt, Miles pulled every favor he had to get a transfer to the 8th Air Force in England. He arrived at RAF Box Ted in February 1944, not as a soldier looking for glory, but as a man on a ghost hunt. He was an outsider, a trade school sergeant in an officer's world, but he possessed a piece of knowledge that the Republic aviation engineers lacked. He knew how engines behaved when the mercury dropped off the bottom of the scale. On a rain-slicked night in March, Miles stood alone over a disassembled R-2800 engine, his breath misting in the air. He wasn't looking for the broken bearings or fractured gears that the experts were obsessed with. Instead, he was looking for something far more subtle, something he'd seen once on a stalled fishing boat in the middle of a Duluth blizzard. As he shone his flashlight into the throat of the carburetor, he saw a faint, crystalline shimmer that made his blood run colder than the English rain. He realized then that the pilots weren't being killed by a mechanical failure. They were being choked by a physical phenomenon that shouldn't exist according to the MIT manuals, but was staring him right in the face. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 4, The Frost That Shouldn't Exist, where Miles recreates the high-altitude conditions in a secret, midnight experiment? On the morning of March 17, 1944, a cold fog clung to the runway at RAF Box Ted like a damp shroud. Miles Theodore Voss was assigned to a salvage detail for a P-47 Thunderbolt that had bellied into a beat field 5 miles from the perimeter. The pilot, Lieutenant Parker, had been the best friend of Miles's late brother, Thomas. Parker had survived the engine failure by the skin of his teeth, but the aircraft was a twisted wreck of olive-drab aluminum. To most, it was just another jug with a temperamental engine, but to Miles, it was a crime scene. As he crawled into the mangled fuselage to inspect the intake system, Miles focused his flashlight on the Bendix-Stromberg pressure carburetor. The experts from Republic had already looked at this wreckage and moved on, citing untraceable mechanical seizure. But Miles saw something they hadn't bothered to document, a faint, lace-like pattern of frost deep inside the Venturi throat. His brow furrowed. At 30,000 feet, the ambient temperature is roughly minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The air is so thin and dry that there shouldn't be enough moisture to form that kind of crystalline structure. It was an atmospheric impossibility, unless the machine was creating its own weather. Miles remembered the fishing boats in Duluth. He knew that when fuel vaporizes, it absorbs a staggering amount of heat. If you combine that fuel cooling with the already brutal cold of the stratosphere and the reduced pressure of the supercharger, you don't just get cold, you get a localized deep freeze. That night, while the rest of the base slept, Miles moved like a ghost through Hangar 7. He had borrowed several blocks of dry ice from the medical supply depot and 2 massive industrial fans from the maintenance pool. In the center of the dark hangar, he rigged a salvaged carburetor to a test stand, packing the dry ice around the intake to simulate the sub-zero temperatures of the European ceiling. At 0200 hours, under the hum of the fans and the hiss of evaporating CO2, Miles watched through a thick glass port. As the fuel began to spray into the Venturi, the phenomenon manifested. Slowly at first, Then with terrifying speed, a wall of white ice began to crawl across the internal throat of the carburetor. Within 10 minutes, the airflow was completely choked off. The engine wouldn't have just sputtered, it would have suffocated. Republic Aviation's engineers had missed it because they were testing in heated cells in New York, protecting their equipment from the very environment the pilots were forced to fight in. They had been looking for a broken part when the real killer was the air itself. Miles stood back, the cold of the hangar seeping into his bones. He had found the ghost. He had the proof that a simple heating coil could save every pilot in the 8th Air Force. But as he looked at the silhouette of the colonel's office through the hangar windows, he realized he was just a sergeant with a trade school certificate and a pile of dry ice. He was about to tell the most powerful men in the military that their $1 million fix was a lie, and he knew exactly how they would react to a mechanic who dared to be right. He had the solution in his pocket, but he had no idea that within 48 hours, he would be forced to choose between his stripes and the lives of the men he served with. By 0600 hours on March 17th, Miles Voss was standing in the sergeant major's office, his eyes bloodshot from a night spent in the frigid shadows of Hangar 7. In his grease-stained hands, he held a series of grainy photographs and a small hand-wound copper element. Sergeant Major Richards, a man who had survived the Great War by trusting his gut more than his orders, looked at the ice-clogged carburetor photos and then at the young sergeant. He didn't ask about regulations. He simply said, "Take it to the colonel. This could save more lives than a wing of Spitfires." 2 hours later, Miles found himself in a world of polished oak and starched collars. Colonel Hastings stared at the modification proposal with a look of profound skepticism. "Sergeant," Hastings began, his voice heavy with the weight of the 8th Air Force's mounting losses, "Republic Aviation has 50 engineers with degrees from MIT and Caltech working this problem. They've spent $2 million on supercharger research. You're telling me you solved it with a piece of copper wire and a soldering iron?" Miles didn't flinch. "It's a simple heating coil, sir. Wrapped around the carburetor throat, drawing 12 amps from the aircraft's electrical system. It prevents the fuel cooling from hitting the freezing point. It costs $2.15 per aircraft and takes 18 minutes to install." The colonel, desperate for a solution but terrified of the political fallout, placed a long-distance call to Raymond Blackwell, the chief engineer at Republic Aviation. The response from New York was a cold, sharp slap of institutional pride. Blackwell didn't just dismiss the theory, he attacked it. "Thermodynamically impossible," he barked over the crackling line. "Your mechanic is a tinkerer who doesn't understand the physics of high-speed airflow. If he continues to spread this misinformation, Republic Aviation will pursue legal action for defamation and interference with war production." The door to the solution was slammed shut by a billion-dollar ego. Hastings hung up the phone and looked at Miles with genuine pity. "Go back to your hangar, Sergeant. If I see you near a carburetor with that wire, I'll have your stripes." Miles returned to the barracks, the silence of the room feel heavier than the English fog. But at 0400 hours on March 18th, the silence was broken by a soft knock. Captain Dutch Keller, a test pilot who still carried the scars from an engine-out crash in February, stepped into the dim light. "I heard what happened in the front office," Keller whispered. "I've flown those ships at 30,000 feet, Voss. I felt that engine choke. I believe you. I'll fly the test. We'll take a ship up, prove it, and force their hand." Miles looked at the captain, then at his own scarred, oil-stained hands. He knew the cost of what Keller was suggesting. If they were caught, it wasn't just a court-martial. It was desertion in the face of the enemy. "No, Captain," Miles said, his voice steady. "If this thing fails and the engine quits for real, I'm the only one who knows the math of the glide. It's my theory. If it's wrong, it's my funeral." As Keller left, Miles didn't go back to sleep. Instead, he reached for his toolbox. He knew that by dawn, the flight line would be crawling with MPs and the morning patrol would be prepping for takeoff. He had less than 2 hours to commit a crime that would either end the mysterious deaths of hundreds of pilots or ensure his own name was erased from history before the sun reached its zenith. At 0445 hours on March 18, 1944, the line between mechanic and criminal vanished. Miles Voss slipped through the shadows of the electrical supply depot at RAF Boxted, his wire cutters making a sharp, muffled snip as he liberated a spool of high-resistance copper alloy. He wasn't thinking about the articles of war or the death penalty for desertion. He was thinking about the frost he'd seen in the beat field. By 0500, he was crouched inside the cavernous cowling of P-47 Thunderbolt No. 73, a combat-ready fighter fueled with 300 gallons of 100-octane avgas and armed with 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. With the frantic precision of a man running out of time, Miles wrapped the heating coil around the Bendix-Stromberg carburetor throat. His fingers, numb from the biting pre-dawn chill, fumbled with the lead wires as he tapped into the aircraft's main 24-volt DC bus. It was a $2.15 hack job buried in a multi-million-dollar machine. At 0615, the base shifted. Night crews were trudging to the mess hall while the morning shift was still rubbing sleep from their eyes. In the confusion, Miles climbed into the cockpit, strapped into the parachute he'd barely learned to use, and brought the massive R2800 engine to life. The roar of 2,000 horses shattered the morning silence. As he taxied toward the main strip, the control tower's radio crackled with panicked authority. 7-3, you are not cleared for taxi. State your intentions. Miles keyed the mic, his voice a forced calm. Just an engine test run, tower. Checking a manifold pressure surge. Before they could respond, he jammed the throttle forward. The 7-ton fighter surged, the turbocharger's whine reaching a scream as he lifted off and disappeared into a thick bank of low-hanging clouds. He climbed relentlessly, the altimeter needle spinning past 20,000, then 30,000 feet. At 32,000 feet over the English Channel, the cockpit glass began to frost. It was time. Miles reduced the throttle to 65% and leaned the fuel mixture, the exact conditions that had sent 89 of his countrymen to their deaths. He waited. For 15 minutes, the sky remained a lethal, silent blue. Then the surge began. The airframe shuddered as the engine gasped for air. At 18 minutes, the RPMs plummeted. The jug was suffocating. Ice was bridging the Venturi throat, turning his engine into a massive, useless anchor. Miles reached for the toggle switch he'd rigged to the instrument panel. Click. For 90 agonizing seconds, the aircraft fell. The channel rushed up to meet him as the engine sputtered and coughed. Then, with a violent, triumphant roar, the R2800 cleared its throat. The ice had melted. Power surged back into the airframe, pinning Miles against his seat. It worked. The $2 fix had conquered the stratospheric ghost. But as Miles leveled off, a sharp, rhythmic chirping erupted in his headset. The unmistakable sound of the British chain-home radar operators detecting an unauthorized blip. He wasn't just a thief anymore, he was a lone target. And across the water at the Luftwaffe base in Abbeville, the German radar crews were already calling alarm, scrambling for Bf-109s to intercept the stationary American target that had just reappeared on their screens. Miles had proven his theory, but now he had to survive a dogfight in a stolen plane he barely knew how to fly. The Freya radar station at Abbeville-Druckett didn't blink. To the German operators of Jagerschwader 26, the Abbeville boys, the lone American blip hovering at 32,000 feet was an insult. Within minutes, 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109G Gustavs were screaming off the French tarmac, led by Lieutenant Heinz Nock, a veteran ace with 50 kills who specialized in hunting unescorted stragglers. Miles Voss, staring through the frost-rimmed canopy of P-47 No. 73, saw the sun glinting off the narrow wings of the climbing interceptors and felt his stomach drop. "Oh hell," he whispered into the dead air of the cockpit. "What have I done?" Miles was a master of engines, not air combat. He knew the theory of energy management, but he had never felt the terrifying vibration of 20mm cannon fire tearing through aluminum. The Bf-109s were faster in the climb, their Daimler-Benz engines optimized for the hunt. As they closed the distance, Nock rolled into a firing pass. A jagged line of holes suddenly stitched across Miles's left wing, and a thunderous crack echoed through the fuselage as a shell perforated the tail section, severing one of the 2 redundant rudder cables. The P-47 shuddered, its nose wanting to wander into a lethal slip. Miles knew he couldn't outturn the Germans, but he had 7 tons of American steel and a supercharger that was finally, gloriously breathing free. He jammed the stick forward and kicked the remaining rudder. The jug did what it did best. It fell like a grand piano. Miles pushed the throttle past the wire, redlining the R2800 until the airframe screamed. He watched the airspeed needle sweep past 450, then 500 miles per hour. The world became a blur of gray and white as he pulled 7GS, the centrifugal force draining the blood from his brain and narrowing his vision to a dark tunnel. Nock's gun camera captured the American fighter plunging into a thick channel fog bank at a speed no Messerschmitt could safely match without shedding its wings. The German leader, low on fuel and stunned by the P-47's sudden recovery at an altitude where it should have stalled, signaled his flight to break off. Miles emerged from the soup over the white cliffs of Dover, his engine humming with a smooth, terrifying perfection. By the time he crossed the perimeter of RAF Box Ted at 0742 hours, The entire base was lined up along the runway. He brought the battered number 73 down hard, the severed rudder cable slapping against the floorboards as he taxied toward the tower. He didn't even have time to cut the magnetos before a phalanx of Willis MB jeeps swarmed the aircraft. MPs with unsheathed .45s surrounded the cockpit. As Miles slid back the canopy, the cold English air hit his sweat-soaked face. Colonel Hastings stood at the front of the crowd, his expression unreadable, flanked by two stone-faced officers. Miles climbed down, his legs shaking so violently he nearly fell. "Staff Sergeant Voss," Hastings said, his voice cutting through the dying whine of the turbine. "You are under arrest for the theft of United States military property, unauthorized flight operations in a combat zone, and desertion of your post in a time of war." Miles looked at the bullet holes in his tail, then at the heating coil switch on the dash. He had proven the impossible, but as the MPs snapped the cold steel of handcuffs around his wrists, he realized that in the eyes of the Army, he hadn't just saved the air war. Illegally or not, he had just signed his own death warrant. Yet, as he was led away, he saw Captain Keller pushing through the crowd toward the engine cowling with a screwdriver in his hand, and Miles knew the real battle was only just beginning. But as the base gates closed behind him, a frantic telegram was already being encoded at 8th Air Force headquarters. One that would reach the desk of a 3-star general before Miles even reached his cell. The interior of the RAF Boxted stockade was as cold and unforgiving as the high-altitude void Miles Voss had just escaped. Sitting on a narrow cot, he listened to the distant, rhythmic thrum of the bass. A sound he now understood was a symphony of machines that could turn on their masters at any moment. He was facing charges that, in the desperate climate of March 1944, carried the ultimate penalty, execution. Under the Articles of War, he had stolen a combat-equipped fighter, abandoned his post, and engaged the enemy without orders. To the legal officers, he wasn't a savior. He was a liability. But while Miles sat in silence, Captain Dutch Keller was back on the flight line, his hands deep in the guts of P-47 number 73. When he opened the intake manifold, he found exactly what Miles had predicted. While every other ship returning from high-altitude sweeps had traces of moisture or residual frost, number 73's carburetor was bone-dry. The heating coil had functioned perfectly, even under the stress of 20mm impacts and a 500-mile-per-hour dive. Word began to ripple through the hangars like a wildfire. The crazy mechanic from Duluth actually did it. At 1,200 hours, the tension on the base reached a breaking point. A C-47 transport touched down, and out stepped Major General William Kepner, the commander of 8 Fighter Command. Kepner didn't go to the officers' club. He walked straight into Colonel Hastings' office and barked a single order: "I want this mechanic, his modification, and every scrap of data he's got in my office in 1 hour." When Miles was led in, still in his grease-stained coveralls and handcuffs, the general didn't look at his stripes. He looked at the photographs of the ice-clogged Venturi. "How confident are you this works, Sergeant?" Kepner asked, his eyes narrowing. Miles looked the 3-star general in the eye. "Confident enough to fly it against 4-109s, sir. And confident enough to know that if you don't install it, more B-17s are going to fall today." Kepner didn't hesitate. He bypassed Republic Aviation entirely. He ordered an immediate emergency comparison test. 12 P-47s modified with Voss's $2 coil against 12 standard aircraft. For 48 hours, between March 19th and 20th, the two groups were pushed to 30,000 feet in grueling, extended sorties. The results were a landslide. The control group suffered 2 engine surges and 1 total failure. The modified group? 0 failures. Not a single engine skipped a beat. On March 21st, Kepner picked up the secure line to General Jimmy Doolittle, the legendary commander of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle's response was legendary for its brevity. "If a sergeant found the fix MIT couldn't, then the sergeant is our chief engineer. Retrofit every fighter in the European theater immediately. Give him whatever he needs." Vindication had arrived with the force of 1,000 bombers. The handcuffs were removed and the execution order was shredded. But as Miles stood on the tarmac watching a team of mechanics begin the mass retrofit, he saw a black sedan with civilian plates idling near the hangar. The men inside weren't wearing uniforms. They were the corporate lawyers and experts from Republic Aviation, and they weren't there to congratulate him. Miles had saved the air war, but in doing so, he had embarrassed a billion-dollar empire, and they were about to make sure his name was scrubbed from the history books before the first modified fighter even reached Berlin. As the first massive raid to the German capital prepped for takeoff, Miles realized that his fight wasn't over. It was just moving from the cockpit to the shadows of a 50-year cover-up. Between March 22 and April 15, 1944, the airfields of England underwent a silent, frantic transformation. In a Herculean effort that bypassed the usual bureaucratic channels, ground crews worked around the clock to retrofit 2,847 P-47s, P-38 Lightnings, and P-51 Mustangs with a simple copper heating coil. On March 22, the 8th Air Force launched its first deep penetration raid to Berlin with the modified escorts. For the first time in months, the Little Friends stayed with the bombers through every agonizing mile of the sub-zero stratosphere. Out of 674 fighters, not a single engine sputtered. Not one pilot was lost to the ghost of carburetor ice. The impact was a seismic shift in the air war. Between March and August 1944, the American bomber loss rate plummeted by 73%, while the fighter-to-fighter kill ratio surged to a staggering 8-to-1. Historians later estimated that Miles's $2 modification prevented at least 547 catastrophic engine failures. By the time the invasion fleet crossed the Channel on June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe had been systematically swept from the skies, ensuring Allied troops landed under a protective umbrella of uninterrupted air superiority. Yet, as the war moved toward its bloody conclusion, the man who had pulled the engine from the brink was systematically erased. Republic Aviation received a prestigious military commendation for their innovative cold-weather carburetor heating system. Their press releases praised the tireless dedication of their engineering teams. Miles Theodore Voss's name appeared nowhere. His criminal charges were quietly dropped for the convenience of the government, and he was promoted to technical sergeant, then promptly exiled to a training command far from the front lines. His unauthorized flight was classified top secret, a ghost story buried in a mountain of paperwork to protect corporate reputations. When the war ended in May 1945, Miles returned to the frozen shores of Duluth without fanfare. He took a job in maintenance for Northwest Airlines, married a girl named Helen Sorensen, and raised 3 children in a quiet house that never echoed with war stories. For 35 years, he turned wrenches on civilian airliners, never once mentioning the day he stole a fighter and challenged the Luftwaffe. The silence lasted until 1997. It was triggered by the memoirs of Heinz Nock, the German ace who had chased Miles over the Channel. Nock wrote of a mysterious American P-47 that had performed a miraculous recovery at 32,000 feet, an event that didn't match any official flight logs. An aviation historian connected the dots, eventually finding an 80-year-old mechanic in Minnesota who simply shrugged when asked if the story was true. In 1998, 54 years late, the United States Air Force finally corrected the record. In a small ceremony at the Duluth Air National Guard Base, Miles Theodore Voss was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation spoke of exceptional technical expertise and personal courage that had changed the course of the European theater. When the local press asked why he had waited so long to speak up, Miles looked toward the horizon, perhaps seeing the ghost of his brother's B-17. "I didn't do it for medals," he said softly. "I did it so no more bomber crews would die like my brother's friends. That's all that mattered." Miles passed away in 2002 at the age of 84. His obituary mentioned he was a World War II veteran in passing, but his true legacy is found in the sky every single day. Today, every piston-driven aircraft in the world, from the smallest Cessna trainer to the rarest vintage Warbird, utilizes a carburetor heat system based on the principle Miles Voss proved in a stolen plane. He proved that sometimes the most complex problems don't need a billion-dollar equation. They just need a man who isn't afraid to get his hands dirty and risk everything to tell the truth. For 54 years, the world pretended Miles Voss didn't exist while using the very technology he risked his life to invent. He didn't ask for a medal then, and he isn't here to ask for your thanks now. But we are. Don't let his story slip back into the shadows of classified files. Hit that subscribe button to ensure heroes like Miles finally get the audience they deserve. Like this video as a digital salute to a man who chose his brothers over his career. And I want to hear from you. Miles was 26 when he changed history. Comment below with the age you were when you realized that sometimes the rules are meant to be broken. Let's make sure the algorithm knows his name today.